From the archives, Russiagate mania spread beyond a strategy for neutralizing Donald Trump or removing him from office into an excuse for stifling U.S. dissent that challenges the new Cold War, reported Joe Lauria on Deck. 4, 2017. By Joe Lauria. Special to Consortium News. At the end of October 2017, I wrote an article for Consortium News about the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's campaign paying for unvetted opposition research that became the basis for much of the disputed story about Russia allegedly interfering in the 2016 presidential election on the orders of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Hillary Clinton speaking with supporters at a campaign rally in Phoenix, Arizona, March 21, 2016. Gage Skidmore. The piece showed that the Democrats too paid for sources that have engendered belief in Russiagate are at best shaky. First was former British spy Christopher Steele's largely unverified dossier of second- and third-hand opposition research portraying Donald Trump as something of a Russian Manchurian candidate. And the second was CrowdStrike, an anti-Putin private company, examining the DNC's computer server to dubiously claim discovery of a Russian hack. In a similar examination using the same software of an alleged hack of a Ukrainian artillery app, CrowdStrike also blamed Russia, but its software was exposed as faulty and it was later forced to rewrite it. CrowdStrike was hired after the DNC refused to allow the FBI to look at the server. My piece also described the dangerous consequences of partisan Democratic faith in Russiagate, a sharp increase in geopolitical tensions between nuclear-armed Russia and the U.S., and a new McCarthyism that is spreading fear, especially in academia, journalism and civil rights organizations, about questioning the enforced orthodoxy of Russia's alleged guilt. After the article appeared at Consortium News, I tried to penetrate the mainstream by then publishing a version of the article on the HuffPost, which was rebranded from the Huffington Post in April this year by new management. As a contributor to the site since February 2006, I was trusted by HuffPost editors to post my stories directly online. However, within 24 hours of publication on November 4, HuffPost editors retracted the article without any explanation. This behavior breaks with the earlier principles of journalism that the website claimed to uphold. For instance, in 2008, Arianna Huffington told radio host Dawn DeBar that, "We welcome all opinions, except conspiracy theories." She said, "Facts are sacred. That's part of our philosophy of journalism." But Huffington stepped down as editor in August 2016 and has nothing to do with the site now. It is run by Lydia Polgreen, a former New York Times reporter and editor, who evidently has very different ideas. In April, she completely redesigned the site and renamed it HuffPost. Before the management change, I had published several articles on the Huffington Post about Russia without controversy. For instance, the Huffington Post published my piece on November 5, 2016, that predicted 3 days before the election that if Clinton lost she'd blame Russia. My point was reaffirmed by the Campaign Insider book Shattered, which revealed that immediately after Clinton's loss, senior campaign advisors decided to blame Russia for her defeat. On Deck. 12, 2016, I published another piece, which the Huffington Post editors promoted to the front page, called "Blaming Russia to Overturn the Election Goes into Overdrive." I argued that Russia has been blamed in the U.S. for many things, and though proof never seems to be supplied, it is widely believed anyway. After I posted the updated version of the Consortium News piece, renamed "On the Origins of Russiagate," I was informed 23 hours later by a Facebook friend that the piece had been retracted by HuffPost editors. As a reporter for mainstream media for more than a quarter century, I know that a newsroom rule is that before the serious decision is made to retract an article, the writer is contacted to be allowed to defend the piece. This never happened. There was no due process. A HuffPost editor ignored my email asking why it was taken down. Support from independent media like the word fascism, censorship, is an overused and misused accusation, and I usually avoid using it. But without any explanation, I could only conclude that the decision to retract was political, not editorial. The New York Times connect the dots graphic showing the Kremlin sitting atop the White House. I am nonpartisan as I oppose both major parties for failing to represent millions of Americans' interests. I follow facts where they lead. In this case, the facts led to an understanding that the Jan. 6, 2017 FBI, NSA, CIA intelligence assessment on alleged Russian election interference, prepared by what then Director of National Intelligence James Clapper called hand-picked analysts, was based substantially on unvetted opposition research and speculation, not serious intelligence work. The assessment even made the point that the analysts were not asserting that the alleged Russian interference was a fact. The report contained the disclaimer, "Judgments are not intended to imply that we have proof that shows something to be a fact. Assessments are based on collected information, which is often incomplete or fragmentary, as well as logic, argumentation, and precedents." Under deadline pressure on Jan. 6, Scott Shane of The New York Times instinctively wrote what many readers of the report must have been thinking: what is missing from the public report is what many Americans most eagerly anticipated, hard evidence to back up the agency's claims that the Russian government engineered the election attack. Instead, the message from the agencies essentially amounts to, "Trust us." Yet, after the Jan. 6 report was published, leading Democrats asserted falsely that the assessment represented the consensus judgment of all 17 U.S. intelligence agencies, not just the views of hand-picked analysts from 3, and much of the U.S. mainstream media began treating the allegations of Russian hacking as flat fact, not as an uncertain conclusion denied by both the Russian government and WikiLeaks, which insists that it did not get the 2 batches of Democratic emails from Russia. There is also dissent inside the broader U.S. intelligence community about whether an alleged hack over the internet was even possible, based on the download speeds of one known data extraction, which matched what was possible from direct USB access to a computer, i.e., a download onto a thumb drive presumably by a Democratic insider. However, because of the oft-repeated 17 intelligence agencies canard in the mainstream media's careless reporting, the public impression has built up that the accusations against Russia are indisputable. If you ask a Russiagate believer today what their faith is based on, they will invariably point to the Jan. 6 assessment and mock anyone who still expresses any doubt. For instance, an unnamed former CIA officer told The Intercept last month, "You've got all these intelligence agencies saying the Russians did the hack. To deny that is like coming out with the theory that the Japanese didn't bomb Pearl Harbor." That the supposedly dissident Intercept would use this quote is instructive about how imbalanced the media's reporting on Russiagate has been. We have actual film of Japanese planes attacking Pearl Harbor and American ships burning, and we have the eyewitness accounts of thousands of U.S. soldiers and sailors. Yet, on Russiagate, we only have the opinions of some hand-picked intelligence officials who themselves say that they are not claiming that their opinions are fact. No serious editor would allow a self-interested and unnamed source to equate the two in print. In this groupthink atmosphere, it was probably easy for HuffPost editors to hear some complaints from a few readers and blithely decide to ban my story. However, before it was pulled, 125 people had shared it. Ree McGovern, a former CIA analyst and frequent contributor to Consortium News, then took up my cause, being the first to write about the HuffPost censorship on his blog. McGovern included a link to a .pdf file that I captured of the censored HuffPost story. It has since been republished on numerous other websites. Journalist Max Blumenthal tweeted about it. British filmmaker and writer Tariq Ali posted it on his Facebook page. Ron Paul and Daniel McAdams interviewed me at length about the censorship on their TV program. Zero Hedge wrote a widely shared piece, and someone actually took the time, 27 minutes and 13 seconds to be exact, to read the entire article on YouTube. I began a petition to HuffPost's Paul Green to either explain the retraction or restore the article. It gained 3,517 signatures. If a serious fact-check analysis was made of my article, it must exist and can and should be produced. Watchdogs. I also learned that a senior officer at the American Civil Liberties Union rejected my case because he too believes in Russiagate. Both of these serious organizations were set up precisely to defend individuals in such situations on principle, not preference. Vladimir Putin with German Chancellor Angela Merkel on May 10, 2015, at the Kremlin. Russian government photo. In terms of their responsibilities for defending journalism and protecting civil liberties, their personal opinions about whether Russiagate is real or not should be irrelevant. The point is whether journalists should be permitted to show skepticism toward this latest dubiously based groupthink. I fear that, amid the frenzy about Russia and the animosity toward Trump, concerns about careers and funding are driving these decisions, with principles brushed aside. One online publication decidedly took the HuffPost's side. Stephen Perlberg, a media reporter for BuzzFeed, asked the HuffPost why they retracted my article. While ignoring me, the editors issued a statement to BuzzFeed saying that Mr. Loria's self-published piece was later flagged by readers, and after deciding that the post contained multiple factually inaccurate or misleading claims, our editors removed the post per our contributor terms of use. Those terms include retraction for any reason, including, apparently, censorship. Perlberg posted the HuffPost statement on Twitter. I asked him if he inquired of the editors what those multiple errors and misleading claims were. Asked him to contact me to get my side of the story. Perlberg totally ignored me. He wrote nothing about the matter. He apparently believed the HuffPost and that was that. In this way, he acquiesced with the censorship. BuzzFeed, of course, is the sensationalist outlet that irresponsibly published the Steele dossier in full, even though the accusations, not just about Donald Trump but also many other individuals, weren't verified. Then on November 14, BuzzFeed reporter Jason Leopold wrote one of the most ludicrous of a long line of fantastic Russiagate stories, reporting that the Russian Foreign Ministry had sent money to Russian consulates in the U.S. to finance the election campaign of 2016. The scoop generated some screaming headlines before it became clear that the money was to pay for Russian citizens in the U.S. to vote in the 2016 Duma election. That Russiagate has reached this point based on faith and not fact, was further illustrated by a Facebook exchange I had with Gary Sick, an academic who served on the Ford and Carter national security staffs. When I pressed Sick for evidence of Russian interference, he eventually replied, "If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck." When I told him that was a very low bar for such serious accusations, he angrily cut off debate. Part of this Russiagate groupthink stems from the outrage, and even shame, that many Americans feel about Trump's election. They want to find an explanation that doesn't lay the blame on the U.S. citizenry or America's current dysfunctional political, media process. It's much more reassuring, in a way, to blame some foreign adversary while also discrediting Trump's legitimacy as the elected president. That leaves open some hope that his election might somehow be negated. And, so many important people and organizations seem to be verifying the Russiagate suspicions that the theory must be true. Which is an important point, when belief in a story becomes faith-based or is driven by an intense self-interest, honest skeptics are pushed aside and trampled. That is the way groupthink works, as we said in the run-up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. When any doubts about Iraq possessing WMD made you its Saddam apologist. As the groupthink grows, the true believers become disdainful of facts that force them to think about what they already believe. They won't waste time making a painstaking examination of the facts or engage in a detailed debate even on something as important and dangerous as a new Cold War with Russia. This is the most likely explanation for the HuffPost's censorship, a visceral reaction to having their Russiagate faith challenged. While critical news is suppressed, but the HuffPost's action is hardly isolated. It is part of a rapidly growing landscape of censorship of news critical of American corporate and political leaders who are trying to defend themselves from an increasingly angry population. It's a story as old as civilization, a wealthy and powerful elite fending off popular unrest by trying to contain knowledge of how the insiders gain at the other's expense, at home and abroad. Trump being sworn in on January 20, 2017. WhiteHouse.gov. A lesson of the 2016 campaign was that growing numbers of Americans are fed up with 3 decades of neoliberal policies that have fabulously enriched the top tier of Americans and debased a huge majority of the citizenry. The population has likewise grown tired of the elite's senseless wars to expand their own interests, which these insiders try to conflate with the entire country's interests. America's bipartisan rulers are threatened by popular discontent from both left and right. They were alarmed by the Bernie Sanders insurgency and by Donald Trump's victory, even if Trump is now betraying the discontented masses who voted for him by advancing tax and health insurance plans designed to further crush them and benefit the wealthy. Trump's false campaign promises will only make the ruler's problem of a restless population worse. Americans are subjected to economic inequality greater than in the first Gilded Age. They are also subjected today to more war than in the first Gilded Age. American rulers today are engaged in multiple conflicts following decades of post-World War II invasions and coups to expand their global interests. People with wealth and power always seem to be nervous about losing both. So plutocrats use the concentrated media they own to suppress news critical of their wars and domestic repression. For example, almost nothing was reported about militarized police forces until the story broke out into the open in the Ferguson protests, and much of that discontent has been brushed aside more recently. Careerist journalists readily acquiesce in this suppression of news to maintain their jobs, their status and their lifestyles. Meanwhile, a growing body of poorly paid freelancers compete for the few remaining decent-paying gigs for which they must report from the viewpoint of the mainstream news organizations and their wealthy owners. To operate in this media structure, most journalists know to excise out the historical context of America's wars of domination. They know to uncritically accept American officials' bromides about spreading democracy, while hiding the real war aims. Examples abound. America's role in the Ukraine coup was denied or downplayed. A British parliamentary report exposing American lies that led to the destruction of Libya was suppressed, and most infamously, the media promoted the WMD hoax in the fable of bringing democracy to Iraq, leading to the illegal invasion and devastation of that country. A November 2017 60 Minutes report on the Saudi destruction of Yemen conspicuously failed to mention America's crucial role in the carnage. I've pitched numerous news stories critical of U.S. foreign policy to a major American newspaper that were rejected or changed in the editorial process. One example is the declassified Defense Intelligence Agency document of August 2012 that accurately predicted the rise of the Islamic State 2 years later. The document, which I confirmed with a Pentagon spokesman, said the U.S. and its Turkish, European and Gulf Arab allies were supporting the establishment of a Salafist principality in eastern Syria to put pressure on the Syrian government, but the document warned that this Salafist base could turn into an Islamic State. But such a story would undermine the U.S. government's war on terrorism narrative by revealing that the U.S.-backed strategy actually was risking the expansion of the jihadists' foothold in Syria. The story was twice rejected by my editors and has received attention almost entirely, if not exclusively, on much smaller independent news websites. Another story I pitched in June 2012, just a year into the Syrian war, about Russia's motives in Syria being guided by a desire to defeat the growing jihadist threat there, was also rejected. Corporate media wanted to keep the myth of Russia's imperial aims in Syria alive. I had to publish the article outside the U.S., in a South African daily newspaper. In September 2015 at the UN General Assembly, Russian President Vladimir Putin confirmed my story about Russia's motives in Syria to stop jihadists from taking over. Putin invited the U.S. to join this effort as Moscow was about to launch its military intervention at the invitation of the Syrian government. The Obama administration, still insisting on regime change in Syria, refused. And the U.S. corporate media continued promoting the myth that Russia intervened to recapture its imperial glory. It was much easier to promote the imperial narrative and to ignore Putin's clear explanation to French TV channel TF1, which was not picked up by American media. Remember what Libya or Iraq looked like before these countries and their organizations were destroyed as states by our Western partners' forces, Putin said. These states showed no signs of terrorism. They were not a threat for Paris, for the Côte d'Azur, for Belgium, for Russia, or for the United States. Now, they are the source of terrorist threats. Our goal is to prevent the same from happening in Syria. Why Russia is targeted so, where are independent-minded Western journalists to turn if their stories critical of the U.S. government and corporations are suppressed? Tomb of the Unknown Soldier outside the Kremlin Wall, December 6, 2016. Photo by Robert Perry. The imperative is to get these stories out, and Russian media has provided an opening for some. This has presented a new problem for the plutocracy. The suppression of critical news in their corporate-owned media is no longer working if it's seeping out in Russian media, and through some dissident Western news sites on the internet. The solution has been to brand the content of the Russian television network, RT, as propaganda, since it presents facts and viewpoints that most Americans have been kept from hearing, but just because these views, many coming from Americans and other Westerners, are not what you commonly hear on the U.S. mainstream media doesn't make them propaganda that must be stigmatized and silenced. As a Russian government-financed English-language news channel, RT also gives a Russian perspective on the news, the way CNN and the New York Times give an American perspective and the BBC a British one. American mainstream journalists, from my experience, arrogantly deny suppressing news and believe they present a universal perspective, rather than a narrow American view of the world. The viewpoints of Iranians, Palestinians, Russians, North Koreans and others are never fully reported in the Western media, although the supposed mission of journalism is to help citizens understand a frighteningly complex world from multiple points of view. It's impossible to do so without those voices included. Routinely or systematically shutting them out also dehumanizes people in those countries, making it easier to gain U.S. popular support to go to war against them. Russia is scapegoated by charging that RT or Sputnik are sowing divisions in the U.S. by focusing on issues like homelessness, racism, or out-of-control militarized police forces, as if these divisive issues didn't already exist. The U.S. mainstream media also seems to forget that the U.S. government has engaged in at least 70 years of interference in other countries' elections, foreign invasions, coups, planting stories in foreign media and cyber warfare. Now, these American transgressions are projected onto Moscow. There's also a measure of self-reverence in this for successful people with a stake in an establishment that underpins the elite, demonstrating how wonderfully democratic they're compared to those ogres in Russia. The overriding point about the Russian propaganda complaint is that when America's democratic institutions, including the press and the electoral process, are crumbling under the weight of corruption that the American elites have created or maintained, someone else needs to be blamed. Russia is both an old and a new scapegoat. The January 6 intelligence assessment on alleged Russian election meddling is a good example of how this works. A third of its content is an attack on RT for undermining American democracy by reporting on Occupy Wall Street, the protest over the Dakota pipeline and, of all things, holding a third-party candidate debates. According to the Jan. 6 assessment, RT's offenses include reporting that the U.S. two-party system does not represent the views of at least one-third of the population and is a sham. RT also highlights criticism of alleged U.S. shortcomings in democracy and civil liberties, in other words, reporting on newsworthy events and allowing third-party candidates to express their opinions undermine democracy. The report also says all this amounts to a Kremlin-directed campaign to undermine faith in the U.S. government and fuel political protest, but it should be noted those protests by dissatisfied Americans are against privileges of the wealthy and the well-connected, a status quo that the intelligence agencies routinely protect. There are also deeper reasons why Russia is being targeted. The Russiagate story fits neatly into a geopolitical strategy that long predates the 2016 election. Since Wall Street and the U.S. government lost the dominant position in Russia that existed under the pliable President Boris Yeltsin, the strategy has been to put pressure on getting rid of Putin to restore a U.S. friendly leader in Moscow. There is a substance to Russia's concerns about American designs for regime change in the Kremlin. Moscow sees an aggressive America expanding NATO and putting 30,000 NATO troops on its borders, trying to overthrow a secular ally in Syria with terrorists who threaten Russia itself, backing a coup in Ukraine as a possible prelude to moves against Russia, and using American NGOs to foment unrest inside Russia before they were forced to register as foreign agents. Russia wants Americans to see this perspective. Accelerated censorship in the private sector. The Constitution prohibits government from prior restraint, or censorship, though such tactics were imposed, largely unchallenged, during the two world wars. American newspapers voluntarily agreed to censor themselves in the Second World War before the government dictated it. In the Korean War, General Douglas MacArthur said he didn't desire to re-establish wartime censorship, and instead asked the press for self-censorship. He largely got it until the papers began reporting American battlefield losses. On July 25, 1950, the Army ordered that reporters were not allowed to publish unwarranted criticism of command decisions, and that the Army would be the sole judge and jury on what unwarranted criticism entailed, according to a Yale University study on military censorship. After excellent on-the-ground reporting from Vietnam brought the war home to America and spurred popular anti-war protests, the military reacted by instituting, initially in the First Gulf War, serious control of the press by embedding reporters from private media companies which accepted the arrangement, much as World War II newspapers censored themselves. It is important to realize that the First Amendment applies only to Congress and not to private companies, including the media. It is not illegal for them to practice censorship. I never made a First Amendment argument against the HuffPost, for instance. However, under pressure from Washington, even in peacetime, media companies can be pressured to do the government's dirty work to censor or limit free speech for the government. In the past few weeks, we've seen an acceleration of attempts by corporations to inhibit Russian media in the U.S. Both Google and Facebook, which dominate the web with more than 50% of ad revenue, were at first resistant to government pressure to censor Russian propaganda. But they are coming around. Eric Schmidt, executive chairman of Alphabet, Google's parent company, said on November 18, 2017 that Google would derank articles from RT and Sputnik in the Google searches, making the stories harder for readers to find. The billionaire Schmidt claimed Russian information can be repetitive, exploitative, false, or likely to have been weaponized, he said. That is how factual news critical of U.S. corporate and political leadership is seen as a weapon. My own view is that these patterns can be detected, and that they can be taken down or deprioritized, Schmidt said. Though Google would effectively be hiding news produced by RT and Sputnik, Schmidt is sensitive to the charge of censorship, even though there's nothing legally to stop him. We don't want to ban the sites. That's not how we operate, Schmidt said cynically. I am strongly not in favor of censorship. I'm very strongly in favor of ranking. It's what we do. But the deranking isn't only aimed at Russian sites. Google algorithms also are taking aim at independent news sites that don't follow the mainstream herd, and thus are accused of spreading Russian or other propaganda if they question the dominant Western narratives on, say, the Ukraine crisis or the war in Syria. A number of alternative websites have begun reporting a sharp fall-off of traffic directed to their sites from Google search engines. Responding to a deadline from Congress to act, Facebook on November 22, 2017 announced that it would inform users if they have been targeted by Russian propaganda. Facebook's Help Center will tell users if they liked or shared ads allegedly from the St. Petersburg-based internet research agency, which supposedly bought $100,000 in ads over a 2-year period, with more than half these ads coming after the 2016 U.S. election and many not related to politics. The $100,000 sum over 2 years compares to Facebook's $27 billion in annual revenue. Plus, Facebook only says it believes, or it's likely, that the ads came from that firm, whose links to the Kremlin also have yet to be proved. Facebook described the move as part of our ongoing effort to protect our platforms and the people who use them from bad actors who try to undermine our democracy. Congress wants more from Facebook, so it will not be surprising if users will eventually be told when they've liked or shared an RT report in the future. The suppression of dissident news and manipulation of information has since grown worse with the advent of NewsGuard and the discovery of the Integrity Initiative. While the government can't openly shut down a news site, the Federal Communications Commission's vote on whether to deregulate the Internet by ending net neutrality will free private Internet companies in the U.S. to further marginalize Russian and dissident websites by slowing them down and thus discouraging readers from viewing them. Likewise, as the U.S. government doesn't want to be openly seen shutting down RT operations, it is working around the edges to accomplish that. After the Department of Justice forced, under threat of arrest, RT to register its employees as foreign agents under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, State Department spokeswoman Heather Nauert said last Tuesday that FARA does not police the content of information disseminated, does not limit the publication of information or advocacy materials, and does not restrict an organization's ability to operate. She'd earlier said that registering would not impact or affect the ability of them to report news and information. We just have them register. It's as simple as that. Then on Wednesday the Congressional Press Office stripped RT correspondents of their Capitol Hill press passes, citing the FARA registration. The rules of the galleries state clearly that news credentials may not be issued to any applicant employed by any foreign government or representative thereof. Upon its registration as a foreign agent under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, RT Network became ineligible to hold news credentials, read the letter to RT. Even so, Russiagate faithful ignore these aggressive moves and issue calls for even harsher action. After forcing RT to register, Keir Giles, a Chatham House senior consulting fellow, acted as though it never happened. He said in a Council on Foreign Relations cyber brief on November 27, 2017, although the Trump administration seems unlikely to pursue action against Russian information operations, there are steps the U.S. Congress and other governments should consider. I commented on this development on RT America. It would also have been good to have the State Department's Nauert answer for this discrepancy about the claim that forced FARA registrations would not affect news gathering when it already has. My criticism of RT is that they should be interviewing U.S. decision-makers to hold them accountable, rather than mostly guests outside the power structure. The decision-makers could be called out on air if they refuse to appear, as many may well do. Growing McCarthyite attacks Western rulers' wariness about popular unrest also can be seen in the extraordinary and scurrilous attack on the Canadian website globalresearch.ca. The attack started with a chilling study by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization into the relatively obscure website, followed by a vicious hit piece on November 18 by the Globe and Mail, Canada's largest newspaper. The headline was, How a Canadian Website is Being Used to Amplify the Kremlin's View of the World. Lawyer Roy Cohn, right, with Sen. Joseph McCarthy. What once appeared to be a relatively harmless online refuge for conspiracy theorists is now seen by NATO's information warfare specialists as a link in a concerted effort to undermine the credibility of mainstream Western media, as well as the North American and European public's trust in government and public institutions, the Globe and Mail reported. Global research is viewed by NATO's Strategic Communications Center of Excellence, or STRATCOM, as playing a key accelerant role in helping popularize articles with little basis in fact that also happen to fit the narratives being pushed by the Kremlin, in particular, and the Assad regime. I've not agreed with everything I've read on the site, but it is a useful clearinghouse for alternative media. Numerous consortium news articles are republished there, including a handful of mine. But the site's typical sharing and reposting on the internet is seen by NATO as a plot to undermine the free world. Drawing from the NATO report, the Globe and Mail's denunciation of this website continued. It uses that reach to push not only at its own opinion pieces but news reports from little-known websites that regularly carry dubious or false information. At times, the site's regular variety of international affairs stories is replaced with a flurry of items that bolster dubious reportage with a series of opinion pieces, promoted on social media and retweeted and shared by active bots. The newspaper continued, that way, they increase the Google ranking of the story and create the illusion of multi-source verification, said Dinara Baroyan, who does digital forensic research for STRATCOM. But she said she did not yet have proof that global research is connected to any government. This sort of smear is nothing more than a blatant attack on free speech by the most powerful military alliance in the world, based on the unfounded conviction that Russia is a fundamental force for evil and that anyone who has contacts with Russia or shares even a part of its multilateral worldview is suspect. High-profile individuals are now also in the crosshairs of the Neo-McCarthyite witch hunt. On November 25, The Washington Post ran a nasty hit piece on Washington Capitals hockey player Alex Ovechkin, one of the most revered sports figures in the Washington area, simply because he, like 86% of other Russians, supports his president. Alex Ovechkin is one of Putin's biggest fans. The question is, why, ran the headline. The story insidiously implied that Ovechkin was a dupe of his own president, being used to set up a media campaign to support Putin, who is under fierce and relentless attack in the United States where Ovechkin plays professional ice hockey. He has given an unwavering endorsement to a man who U.S. intelligence agencies say sanctioned Russian meddling in last year's presidential election, write the Post reporters, once again showing their gullibility to U.S. intelligence agencies that have provided no proof for their assertions, and even admit that they are not asserting their opinion as fact. Less prominent figures are targeted too. John Kiriakou, a former CIA agent who blew the whistle on torture and was jailed for it, was kicked off a panel in Europe on November 10 by a Bernie Sanders supporter who refused to appear with Kiriakou because he co-hosts a show on Radio Sputnik. Then last week, Reporters Without Borders, an organization supposedly devoted to press freedom, tried to kick journalist Vanessa Beeley off a panel in Geneva to prevent her from presenting evidence that the White Helmets, a group that sells itself as a rescue organization inside rebel-controlled territory in Syria, has ties to Al-Qaeda. The Swiss Press Club, which hosted the event, resisted the pressure and let Beeley speak. Russiagate's hurdles much of this, spreading global hysteria and intensifying censorship traces back to Russiagate. Yet, it remains remarkable that the corporate media has failed so far to prove any significant Russian interference in the U.S. election at all. Nor have the intelligence agencies, congressional investigations and Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller. His criminal charges so far have been for financial crimes and lying to federal authorities on topics unrelated to any collusion between the Trump campaign and Russians to hack Democratic emails. Former FBI Director James Comey. There may well be more indictments from Mueller, even perhaps a complaint about Trump committing obstruction of justice because he said on TV that he fired Comey, in part, because of this Russia thing. But Trump's clumsy reaction to that scandal, which he calls fake news and a witch hunt, still is not proof that Putin and the Russians interfered in the U.S. election to achieve the unlikely outcome of Trump's victory. The Russiagate faithful assured us to wait for the indictment of retired Lieutenant Gen. Michael Flynn, briefly Trump's national security advisor. But again, there was nothing about pre-election collusion, only charges that Flynn had lied to the FBI or omitted details about 2 conversations with the Russian ambassador regarding policy matters during the presidential transition, i.e., after the election. And one of those conversations related to trying unsuccessfully to comply with an Israeli request to get Russia to block a United Nations resolution censuring Israel's settlements on Palestinian land. As journalist Yasha Levine tweeted, so the country that influenced U.S. policy through Michael Flynn is Israel, not Russia. But Flynn did try to influence Russia, not the other way around. Haha. This is the smoking gun? What a farce. There remain a number of key hurdles to prove the Russiagate story. First, convincing evidence is needed that the Russian government indeed did hack the Democratic emails, both those of the DNC and Clinton's campaign chairman John Podesta, and gave them to WikiLeaks. And, further, that somehow the Trump campaign was involved in aiding and abetting this operation, i.e., collusion. There's also the question of how significant the release of those emails was anyway. They did provide evidence that the DNC tilted the primary campaign in favor of Clinton over Sanders. They exposed the contents of Clinton's paid speeches to Wall Street, which she was trying to hide from the voters, and they revealed some pay-to-play features of the Clinton Foundation and its foreign donations. But even if the Russians were involved in providing that information to the American people, those issues were not considered decisive in the campaign. Clinton principally pinned her loss on FBI Director James Comey for closing and then reopening the investigation into her improper use of a private email server while Secretary of State. She also spread the blame to Russia, repeating the canard about 17 U.S. intelligence agencies, all in agreement, Bernie Sanders, the inept DNC and other factors. As for the vaguer concerns about some Russian group probably buying $100,000 in ads, mostly after Americans had voted, as a factor in swaying a $6 billion election, is too silly to contemplate. That RT and Sputnik ran piece as critical of Hillary Clinton was their right, and they were hardly alone. RT and Sputnik's reach in the U.S. is minuscule compared to Fox News, which slammed Clinton throughout the campaign, or for that matter, MSNBC, CNN and other mainstream news outlets, which often expressed open disdain for Republican Donald Trump but also gave extensive coverage to issues such as the security concerns about Clinton's private email server. Another vague Russiagate suspicion stemming largely from Steele's opposition research is that somehow Russia is bribing or blackmailing Trump because Trump has done some past business with Russians. There are evidentiary and logical problems with these theories, since some lucrative deals fell through, and presumably wouldn't have if Trump was being paid off, and no one, including the Russians, foresaw Trump's highly improbable election as U.S. president years earlier. Some have questioned how Trump could have supported détente with Russia without being beholden to Moscow in some way. But Jeffrey Summers, a political scientist at the University of Wisconsin, wrote a convincing essay explaining advisor Steve Bannon's influence on Trump's thinking about Russia and the need for cooperation between the two powers to solve international problems. Without convincing evidence, I remain a Russiagate skeptic. I am not defending Russia. Russia can defend itself. However, amid the growing censorship and a dangerous new McCarthyism, I am trying to defend America from itself. Joe Lauria is the editor-in-chief of Consortium News. He has been a correspondent for the Boston Globe, the Sunday Times of London and the Wall Street Journal among other newspapers. He is the author of How I Lost by Hillary Clinton, published by OR Books in June 2017. He can be reached at joelauria@consortiumnews.com and followed on Twitter @unjoe.